everybody. I'm Jeff Saltzman, the CEO of OrgVitality, and welcome to the webinar, Nudges to Drive Organizational Change. Let me take a moment to introduce a friend of mine and a work companion, Scott Brooks, who will be the presenter today. Scott is a partner and vice president of consulting services at OV. He's been here since the very beginning, day one. Scott has over 30 years of experience, going back even further than the founding of OV, in the field of industrial organizational psychology. Scott has a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from The Ohio State University and a bachelor's from Cornell. Scott is also a fellow in the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. And Scott is an author, co-author of many chapters and books. And I think one of the most notable ones, which is coming out shortly, is Scott is the co-author of a chapter on surveys that's going to be coming out in the Handbook of IO Psychology. And with that, Scott, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm delighted to be here. I am delighted to talk about nudges. I think it's an exciting time if you are invested in behavioral sciences and how they work inside organizations and so forth. And certainly with nudges, there's a lot of buzz, a lot of activity and a lot of excitement about it, maybe not a lot of clarity. And that's what we're really here to do, and to try to pin down what some of these concepts are, what it means, and what maybe you can do about it inside your own organizations. So I'm gonna get started with sort of a thought image here. And if you were to just picture your own organization, right? Think about all of the projects you have going, all of the efforts that you have that require somebody else to be doing something about it in order to be successful. Maybe you're managing employee surveys or leadership development programs or other kinds of organizational change in general. But if you think about it, right now, somewhere in your organization, there's an employee who should be maybe taking the survey who's just not doing it. Right now, somewhere in your organization, there's a manager wondering, how am I supposed to do what HR is asking me to do? Or right now, they're probably frustrated OD and HR people who've trained them, given them all the data slices they've asked for, but somehow the needle just isn't moving on impact. And probably pretty clearly right now, this is, I think I'll go on a limb and guarantee this for you, and I'll buy you a cup of coffee if this turns out to be wrong. But you have a CEO right now who's frustrated by the slow pace of change. So what do we do in our work in trying to manage change in organizations or manage data, HR metrics, listening programs, whatever? We look for all the tools and techniques and approaches and best practices we can. We look for anything that can help. And nudges are one of those promises that might be able to do something. And so that's what we're going to talk about, nudges. And like I said, what do we want? We are the architects of change programs, listening programs, other kinds of programs. And our success depends deeply on the earnest effort of others. I will say, and I say this a lot, it's become one of my favorite slogans, is dashboards don't create change, people do. And so how do we move from data and online tools and so forth out into the world? And in helping this, we have to lift our heads out of our databases and leverage whatever we can. And nudges, reminders, accountabilities, clear assignments, executive championship, training, other kinds of upskilling, anything else we can come up with. And this takes work. So we want more action, and we want, wherever possible, to have these actions be simple to implement, simple to maintain, and generally we just want more impact. And like I said, nudges can help. And part of the theme of this webinar is nudges can help. They're only going to be part of the solution. They're not going to be magical by themselves. What we're going to cover throughout this is just a little bit of grounding on what is a nudge, some definitional and some characteristics that surround what a nudge is. We're going to talk about how to elevate a nudge beyond just a smart reminder, how to use nudges to create meaningful change, design nudges to be strategic, not just generic in an organization. And then, how to implement nudges in listening programs and so forth. What I want to do as we get started here is begin with a quick poll. The question is, are you the kind of person who values innovation in the programs you manage? Yes. Okay, so everybody's answered yes. That's pretty obvious. It's pretty clear. One of the things, the quick nudge examples out in the world is regard to voting. And, so are you the kind of person who values doing your civic duty and voting? If you just simply ask that question, people are more likely to vote. There's other things you can do too, for sure. But my point here is you've just been nudged. So if you are the kind of person who values innovation, this should be a webinar for you. And now, believe it or not, you are just a little bit more likely to act on the information in this webinar than you were before I asked that question. So coming to it, what is a nudge? Well, nudging first burst onto the scene in 2008 with the first edition of this book by Thaler and Sunstein about nudging. And this book covered, opt-in 401ks. It covered placement of foods in cafeterias. It covered commitment devices for increasing your fitness and all kinds of things. But it was very exciting, and it set up this idea of nudging, which is setting up choice architecture to alter behavior in a predictable way without removing options or incentives. Now, that's kind of a mouthful, but what does it mean? It means that you set up the context of work or a decision that somebody operates within. And to count as a mere nudge, it has to be cheap and easy to avoid. Nudging is not mandates. It's not changing economic incentives. Putting fruit at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food does not. Nudges are the kinds of things that work on human beings based on an understanding of human psychology and behavioral sciences. They do not work on robots or Mr. Spock or any perfectly rational being that tends to be more mythical than real. So if it wouldn't work on a robot, but does on a human, it could be a nudge. If it would work on a robot, it's not a nudge. And this actually is the crux of the difference between behavioral economics versus traditional economics. Now, I said this is a mouthful, some fairly simple characteristics around a nudge. It's simple, it's focused on a specific behavior, often self-powering, it's not mandated, it's not an edict, it doesn't have clear incentives for punishments or rewards or whatever, but it is grounded in science. And the piece of it I like to focus on is that it helps people live up to their own good intentions. This assumes, and I think fairly assumes, that people want to improve themselves. They want to improve the workplace. They want to be good employees. Clearly, there might be some people where that's not true. But let's assume that it's true. And sometimes a nudge can be automatic or self-powering. And after design, the repeat effort maybe might not be a heck of a lot. But this is helping you craft and understand what a nudge is. Let me give you some examples. It's easy to say these things, but let me give you some examples. And so what would a nudge look like? And let's say in this particular set of examples that you sent out a survey and your primary goal is to drive some response rates. I think we've all been there. And so first of all, a reminder, all surveys have reminders, and it goes out to the survey population, basically says, if you haven't, please take the survey. Yay, all right, that's awesome. Now, we can do better than that, and a smart reminder might add some configurations to it. For example, and this is the kind of thing that I'm sure we've all done, maybe with 1 week left in the survey administration window, you survey not just or you send a note to not just everybody, but all non-respondents, and you say, hey, please take the survey. There's only 1 week left. Logical, perfect, whatever. To really qualify as a nudge, you need to add the behavioral science component. And an example here is to all non-respondents, maybe when you hit 51% response rate, your next note can be, hey, most people have taken the survey, don't miss your chance. This behavioral science dynamic is actually based on the nudge called social norms. And this is often one of the most potent types of dynamics you can add to a nudge. Interestingly, people don't think it's going to be the most important. They don't think it's going to work on them. There was a pretty well-known study a while back about energy usage, and people were given information like in a little door hanger that went around a neighborhood. Now, there's different messages or information that could be on here. Sometimes the message said, hey, save energy, it'll save you money. Others said things like, hey, save money or save energy, it's good for the planet or good for the children. And there was one message that went out to about 1/4 of the population that was, hey, save energy, your neighbors already are. Turns out that people thought the least effective message would be the save energy because your neighbors are. But in fact, the most impactful message was that one on social norms, which is save energy, your neighbors are. So anyway, this is an important point about what really separates nudges from just the basic mechanics of executing a project. We can have reminders, we can be smart about them, but to add a behavioral science dynamic really elevates it to being a nudge. And so in the mechanics of nudges, is there an overlap with smarter messaging and so forth? Well, both types can include similar execution of distributing messages to people, right? But the tone and focus can be subtly different. For example, smart reminders could be the just-in-time reminders, email or SMS or whatever, or a rhythmic drip of useful nuggets to people and all kinds of things like that. But to be a nudge, to inspire action, you need to add that behavioral sciences component. Like I mentioned, social norms or reducing cognitive load. There is a long list of possible types of nudges. So there is a bunch of overlap here. We can say, well, which is it? Is it this? Is it that? Or the other thing? First of all, in the end, I don't really care. If there's a smart reminder that helps, great, let's use it. If there's a nudge that helps or something, the gray zone, fine. But I also want to highlight that critically, nudges are not only pushed messages, as the illustration examples I provided, those are pushed messages. Nudges can also use other mechanics to help you frame something, to ask people a question or solicit commitments or other ways to restructure decisions. I'll be giving you some more examples, but just note that nudges don't have to be pushed messages out at people, because we all know this in our own lives. We're pushed messages a lot. And so we want to be thinking of other ways to do things. So let me give you some 4 quick concepts of nudges and give you a quick summary. Social norms, I've talked about. This is where you're aligning with how people want to see themselves in the world. And you might share what's normal or what's expected. And this is a quick example. Take your little home. Other people do. There's another study in the petrified forest here in California that said, hey, don't be taking pieces of petrified wood. Everybody is, and pretty soon it'll be gone. The psychological dynamic underlying that message can also be seen as, whoops, all of this is disappearing. If I don't take a piece of petrified wood now, it'll all be gone. And so that actually encouraged people to take pieces of petrified wood. But, just saying, hey, take your litter home, other people do, that's leading into what you're telling people is common behavior. Next one is context, illustrating the implications of actions. And so here's a very simple one, which is, hey, every time you take a piece of paper, it helps deplete the rainforests in South America. Changing defaults is a classic one, where, do you change it from an opt-in to an opt-out? And that can also reduce mental load, and help change what people do. You're not changing what people can do. You're still giving them the same choice, but you're just starting from a different position. And a commitment device, let me describe what this image is. There is an alarm clock where you can put in a $20 bill, let's say, in the evening when you set your alarm. If you hit snooze too many times, this alarm clock will shred your money. And so that's a fairly extreme example, but I love it. And what this is doing is this is helping your future-looking rational self, your self at night that says, I really do want to get up at 5:30 to exercise. And it's helping influence the impulsive self that's going to exist at 5:30 the next morning that's saying, I want to sleep, I don't want to exercise, right? And so commitment devices, I think, are some of my favorite types of nudges. There are plenty of others. Framing, priming, understanding mappings, which is what really relates to what, and what are the sort of the downstream implications of what I might be doing. Feedback to know progress, inoculation against cognitive biases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can keep going down this list. The point here is not to have an exhaustive list, right? Because new types are being researched all the time. So the point is to say there's a lot of different kinds of things you can do. And while there are many, generally nudges work on a couple of different areas. They can work on our attention. For example, a cueing or other kinds of reminders can be nudges. They can work on perception, which is how do I understand a particular issue or stimulus in the environment. Framing is one. And I'll give you some examples of that. They can work on memory, which is, maybe like priming, how to cue somebody into what they might be looking at or what they should pull from, from the memory banks. They work on effort, changing the defaults makes something easier, much less effort. And they can work on motivation, like commitment devices, trying to help you do that. So, attention, perception, memory, effort, so forth. These are the things that nudges actually do. People like multiple choice. So changing the defaults here, rather than just sort of an open-ended thing into this chat. Tell me which norms you kind of like here. So it's fairly balanced between a lot of these things. There's plenty of people liking all of them. And I think that's a good kind of a sign, which is that there's a lot of different nudges and it kind of depends on what we're trying to do. So let me move on from this. I mentioned that there are non-messaging nudges. What are some examples of not just pushing an email or a note at people? And I also mentioned before, by the way, that nudges work best when we have a specific behavior in mind, with a behavioral science dynamic underneath them. And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First of all, a classic one that we researched in OrgVitality and it's been putting in play for a long time. And Victoria Hendrickson within our organization is really the champion of this. She's written a book on comment analysis and so forth. But upstream in the survey, when you're asking people, it's like, hey, what's a good idea to improve how we work around here, or whatever it is that you've got, you can frame that open-ended question a little differently with a nudge mechanic that is only a little bit of a short text above open ends, and it describes basically What makes for a useful comment? And we actually did a true experiment where we randomized essentially what people saw, whether they saw this little nudge or not. And it was a really quick and easy dynamic to randomize. Odd numbered survey respondents got this, even numbered didn't. And I'm going to call that random, which I don't think anybody would really debate. But turns out that the just having this little text up there that says, hey, this is what makes a useful comment, that improved usefulness of comments by 5 times, based off of human coding of was this comment really useful or not. So anyway, that's just one little quick example of framing, right? It helps structure in people's minds what the assignment really is. It frames it up. Another one, let's talk about 360s for a minute. 360 assessments for, evaluating and improving leadership styles. And there is a typical problem in many 360s, which is leniency, feeling effects. People are too nice in their ratings and may not have enough differentiation in the scores. And one of the things we often do is on any page in the assessment, if somebody answered, let's say, all 5s, or this person's a role model for everything on this page, we put a little prompt, a little nudge that pops up that says, hey, is this person really a role model? Is simply not many people are all 5s on absolutely everything. Is that really your assessment of this individual? Now, I wasn't very articulate and crisp in the way I just said it now, but that's essentially what the message is. We don't mandate that people have to go back and do anything or change anything, but we are helping them understand that maybe not everybody's a 5 all the time. And there's some other things we do there. Now, is this inoculation against cognitive biases? Is it framing? Could we make arguments that it's something else? We can. Often nudge mechanics overlap between different psychological dynamics, and that means they're trying to do a lot of different things, which is great. So I don't want to sweat exactly what the behavioral science dynamic is. I want to illustrate them, but we want to be inspired by them. But many nudges actually do represent multiple behavioral science dynamics. Last one I want to say here is focusing priorities. And so somebody gets, let's say, a survey report. There's a lot going on, or a 360 report, or any kind of survey data. How do you help somebody focus on what are the most important issues? And what that helps is to reduce the cognitive load. You might not say you have to work on this topic, but you might say, hey, based off of the systems evaluation, these might be the things that you work on. And in fact, that's the nudge mechanic underlying this. It was an algorithm that was actually trained against what actual human consultants might advise, right? And so it tries to pick up not just on what scores are low, because that's what people naturally go for, but we all know that you want to work on not just what's low, but what's most important. And those are not necessarily the same things. So anyway, these are just a couple of examples of non-messaging nudges. And they illustrate a key feature that I've been highlighting, which is identifying a specific behavior. And some generic survey or listening program behaviors are things like this. You want to say, hey, did you review your results online, or did you download a report, or did you at least look and access the scores that you're supposed to access? Have you selected a focus? Have you had a meeting to discuss this? Have you set a goal? Did you use a resource? One of the things that's true and I would say any corporation today is that you have way more resources available for managers out in the world than they actually use. Might be a recognition system. It might be learning and development or career pathing kinds of things, or plenty of other resources in HR that people just don't use. You nudge people towards those, and they are an effective solution in many cases. But anyway, that's using a resource, one of my favorite behaviors to try to nudge. And then the last one that's listed here is revisit the plan. These are just examples of what you're trying to get people to do. But what we're doing is we're breaking down the big task of survey. You can't just say, hey, work on your survey. That's too big, too vague, too daunting to really nudge. We want something else here. And by the way, you get bonus power if you're identifying not these generic kinds of behaviors, but you are identifying unique behaviors to your situation. I'm going to give you an example of that in the future too. By the way, the more specific, the easier the behavior is to nudge. Like, did you even log into the system after your results are available? That's very specific. It's a click for somebody to do. That's easier to nudge than something more like setting a goal, which requires some effort in the doing of it. By the way, there's one study that identified that 21% of managers were more likely to if they were nudged early in this kind of flow of generic survey-related examples. That same study or set of studies identified that social norms were some of the most effective. And so this won't always be the most effective, but I think it's worth knowing that it is one of the more effective ones. And also this particular set of studies identified that after 2 nudges, there were some diminishing returns, which kind of makes sense. You can't just keep hammering people with emails. You might just say, here, let's do a couple of times and be happy with our 21% more likely to act. So how do we design nudges given this, right? So we're starting with some specific behaviors in mind. And there can be a lot of things that we want to nudge people to do. Fitness, this particular nudge that's written here in these stairs, it says, what kind of person do you want to be, essentially? There's a lot that is related to that. Are you the kind of person who votes? You were nudged when I asked you earlier in the poll, are you the kind of person who likes to innovate? It's like, yeah. And so reminding people what they aspire to be is fantastic. And you can start to think about reminding managers, what kind of manager do you want to be? Are you the kind of manager who is focused on self-improvement? Are you the kind of manager who wants to be, a role model for their employees? All those kinds of things. Partly when we are looking at designing nudges, we want to know when they are more or less useful, right? So what kind of context are we really looking at? Nudges are talked about as most useful when individuals are inexperienced or poorly informed, so they're not experts. Maybe we're asking them to do something outside of their normal work duties. The task is difficult, rare, unfamiliar, right? Maybe it's something that HR asks us to do, and we're not a fan of providing feedback to people. It's a little too awkward in conversations and doesn't happen maybe as much as it should. Or the feedback on the performance is slow or infrequent, like organizational change, right? How do you know if organizational change is effective? That's a slow, infrequent, hard to measure kind of thing, which is kind of related. How do you know what good looks like? Any of the soft people stuff makes it hard to know what good looks like. And, where the risk is more about focus and motivation and not raw ability. Nudges don't act on capacity or competence or ability to execute something. That's for training, selection, development, other kinds of things. That's not nudging. Nudging is a little bit more on keeping people focused and keeping people motivated or keeping their attention on something. And so, again, like I said, nudges act on, attention, perception, memory, effort, general motivation to create change. So let's say we are looking to create commitment to change. Let me give you some more examples of the kinds of things you might twist into your own organization, again, with a specific behavior, some example behavioral science dynamics underneath, and some nudge mechanics, right? So maybe you want people, it's like, hey, just hold a survey results discussion with the team, or hold some sort of feedback or team-based, data-based team level conversation, right? that happens a lot, and it's what we want. And so maybe we can focus on the commitment device kind of thing. So what kind of nudge mechanic would lean into those types of things? Well, maybe we prompt early in the process to any manager who's supposed to be doing this. Maybe it's managers that we expect will get a report once the survey is done. So we can do this early. We don't have to wait. And you say, look, block time in your calendar for these discussions at X amount of time, because that's when these should be happening. And so what happens if something's in your calendar? First of all, it kind of is the default thing that you do, right? So I know I'm saying commitment device here, but there's an element of changing defaults. If I already have a team discussion scheduled for next December, it's kind of a default that I'm going to do it, right? But if the team is invited, it also gives me a little bit of social pressure. It's public. But really, if I am the person who puts it in my calendar, I am telling my future self, I want to do this, and I'm making it easier for my future self, and it's a commitment device. By the way, aside from the alarm clock, one of the first examples of commitment device that I bumped into out there is, let's say you want fitness, and let's say you want to lose 20 pounds by the end of the year, something like that. If you write a check to a charity you do not like, right, something that runs counter to your own personal values, let's say, you give it to your lawyer and you say, if I don't weigh in 20 pounds lighter on December 31st, mail this check. That's a commitment device. It's very extreme. You want to be careful when you do things like that. But, if it's a check of $1,000 going to a place you do not respect, then that forces you more likely to get out of bed at 5:30 every morning and do whatever you're trying to do. All right, here's another example of commitment to change. I want people to actively monitor their action plan. So maybe I want to say, let me think about what inoculation against cognitive biases might do. There's actually research on this one, where you can ask, what advice would you give others to keep focused on creating meaningful action from the survey? A lot of the original research on this was done in an academic setting, and the question was, what advice would you give others to not procrastinate on doing your homework? And the research found that it's like, yeah, sure, you might get some good answers or some interesting things that people say, but the mere act of responding made people less likely to procrastinate themselves. And so the mere act here of asking people, what advice would you give, helps them overcome some of maybe their cognitive resistance to action. It puts them in a positive sort of frame of mind towards the activity. And it has them think through maybe some barriers that might emerge as they get there. Plus, as a bonus, you get all the responses. And maybe that would be a useful catalog of advice to give other people. All right. All this is fine, but I did say there is a bonus to working on more unique things to your organization. And so if I'm going to talk about a unique example, I'm going to risk being not broadly applicable to the whole audience here, but bear with me and sort of roll with it. And I'm going to be talking about something unique, which we say a lot in OrgVitality. To be strategic requires you to be unique. At an organizational level, you cannot copy your way to a competitive differentiation. And so working on something that's unique is a great thing to do, and it's really valuable. So here, let's just roll with a specific example. So let's say in my organization, there's a strategic context. And in this particular case, plucked from an organization's strategic plan, the organization is trying to focus on growing add-on services, and that this requires collaboration with different delivery channels of services. Different organizations have different paths between creating the value and then delivering it to their organization. And, that's a delivery channel, right? So, you could pick something else from your strategic plan and sort of think about that as we go through this. But let's say that this is what we're all working on together. Now, one of the things that's true is that this does not apply equally to every single employee in the organization. So I'm going to have a couple of populations of focus. Let's say I'm focused on those liaisons with the delivery channels. It could be franchise management people, it could be retail store people, it could be other sort of internet shopping maintenance kinds of people or call centers. But who really interacts with those delivery channels, and who are the service focused people? So let's say I'm already sort of narrowed a little bit to that, because that would help boost the strategy more. And maybe there's a couple of different specific behaviors I want to focus on. Let's say that in this whole flow, maybe it's after a survey, maybe it's part of a larger organizational change, whatever it is, but I know we need to improve cross-functional efforts, right? We've already known that this requires collaboration with different, parts of the service chain, towards all these delivery channels. But and maybe I've got some, group sessions and some other stuff scheduled, and some other things, some mandates maybe are also coming down, maybe some restructuring from executives, all those things, not quite nudges, but nudges are nestling inside that. So part of that structure I've got already is that there's going to be some cross-functional brainstorming. And so I'm looking at like, hey, let's understand mappings and maybe lean into some loss aversion. Loss aversion, if you don't know it, is powerful. Basically, what it says is that the threat of losing something is twice as powerful as the prospect of gaining that same amount of value, right? So the threat of losing $10 is twice as powerful on the way I act than the promise or the possibility of gaining $10, right? So I want to make sure that people don't feel like they're losing something. So I might reframe this a little bit as, how do we avoid loss? And so part of my, cross-functional meeting might include a section on asking people to figure out, like, what are the reasons why the status quo is insufficient, right? And so that's framing not changing as a loss, right? Rather than framing changing as a gain. Kind of subtle, but it helps, right? And so I do that. Asking the question might get some better brainstorming that might follow that kind of a thing. Another thing, let's say that I want to implement some of those brainstormed ideas. We've all been there, and we may not have labeled it this, but I love the term innovation theater. Innovation theater is when you get people together, you brainstorm, you have the flip charts, you do a lot of things, and then nothing really improves. But it makes you feel better in the moment. It makes the executives and everybody around you feel better, like something is happening. But that's innovation theater. And so the question here is, how do we avoid that? Let's say social norms. And so after this kind of a meeting, let's say you've got some commitments, and maybe we publicly list or announce those commitments. And then we have some group reviews, either with senior leadership. If I know I'm going to have to be in front of senior leadership and do something in 3 months, I want something smart to say. If I know that I've made a public commitment to do something, and my direct reports or other people below me in my pyramid know that that's happening, that's something to work through. So anyway, these are ways to try to nudge along this strategic action, right? And so we've got this context, and there's different ways to sort of map this flow. And I'm giving you just this sort of example, a couple of examples. Now, we can work through all this, we can do these things, but it's important that nudges are research inspired. And nudges aren't magical. You can expect a meaningful impact, but the important element here is that they don't work on the fanatics or the slackers that are going to do what they do anyway. Nudges work on the maybe part of the distribution, kind of the middle, and they just move that hump just a little bit. That's what we're doing. And often when we do this, there's some important considerations when we create and implement nudges. First of all, as I mentioned a few times, it's not training, it's not coaching or improving capabilities or making something mandated or accountable or messing with incentives. Those are important. You got to have those, and nudges can nestle up against those, but that's not what nudges are. Uh, Also important for nudges is that they need ongoing evaluations. What really works? You learn by experiment. You learn by testing. Um, in the end, also people are great at ignoring things. They're great at learning to ignore stuff. And so a nudge might work for a little while, and then it sort of burns out. People have habituated to it. Anybody who's tried different diets kind of knows that you try something for a while, and then you need something novel to keep going. Otherwise, the diet fad industry wouldn't be as profitable as it is. You got to watch the drift from nudge to nag, right? If people have started ignoring you and your nudges, more nudges are just going to appear as nags. So you want to keep it efficient, not more nudges than you need, and you want to sort of get what you can get out of it and then sort of step away, and you want to keep it fresh. The nag thing is a real issue, and nudges need to be monitored, and it's easy to descend from nudge to nag, right? So acknowledge that the power to sit on the couch with ice cream and not exercise is very strong, and it will always be there and can always spring back into the radar. And just like not acting on survey results is strong. And we've got to avoid the creepy zone. Be aware of the privacy optics of nudge triggers. If I want to send out nudges to people who haven't scheduled a meeting by scraping their calendar, that might feel a little creepy, right? And you want to be aware of that kind of a thing. There's some research that have suggested that nudges are better when people have their own ownership. And so, how do you help them own the nudge and maybe self put something in their own calendar rather than telling them, you don't have this in your calendar, you really should. But transparency is key. And so that's kind of related to this last point where it works best if you've got aligned the organization's motives with the manager's motives, the employee's motives, and you keep it all transparent. If you would hesitate to stand up in front of your organization and announce the types of nudges you're doing, that might be a clue that maybe this is a little creepy. So I've kind of reviewed this, but let me just give you some steps. If we're implementing nudges and listening programs, first we got to crystallize the assignment. What are we asking people to do? We want to map the specific behaviors needed to execute on that assignment. Identify the critical or weak spots in those behaviors. What are necessary paths to moving forward, like looking at your own survey results? And what are the weak spots? Where do things really fall down? Then review some example nudge concepts, some behavioral dynamics that might help. And I'm going to illustrate this point actually with creating a quick poll here. Personally, let's say you want to do nudges. When will you schedule personal time to just go Google your favorite nudge or something that you might do? Answer this question. When might you go ahead and do that? A lot of you are saying, all right, yeah, I'm gonna put time in my personal calendar next week to set aside some time to Googling and doing some other kinds of research about this. So this is great. Now, again, you were just kind of nudged. You've made at least a little bit of a commitment to yourself to put time in your calendar. Now, are you actually going to do it? put time in the calendar, and then when that time comes, you're actually going to do this or get distracted. I don't know. That's on you. But right now, you've got a little bit of a nudge of when you might do something. So fantastic. That's about reviewing the nudge concepts. Then you want to craft the nudges, whether they're messages or other mechanics, measure and track results. By the way, if you want another way to help learn about different nudge concepts, I'm a regular listener to a podcast called Choiceology. It's actually sponsored by Charles Schwab, but that's in the background, about investing and so forth. But it's Katie Milkman is behavioral scientist at Wharton, I think, and she hosts it. So it has the right kind of academic foundation, but real practical and interesting kind of content. Again, that's called Choiceology. Now, everything we've been talking about sits within a big theme that is worth mentioning, which is the precious commodity in today's workplace is really attention, not data. Data exists everywhere. We're kind of saturated by it. And in listening programs and other things, we're trying to push more of it, which is great and important. But there is an old adage, right? What gets measured gets done. That's out of date. We're information saturated. We got plenty that gets measured. It's not just the measurement that makes things happen anymore. And so if the rare commodity is data, is attention, not data, then the implication here is don't design change management or listening programs for pushing data, right? Dashboards don't create change, people do. Rather design for capturing the attention, prompting the constructive conversations, and then this nudging or compelling of action. One thing that we do have in OrgVitality, just as a quick note to help streamline nudge delivery, is we have a tool that helps you target specific populations based off of scores and action progress and hierarchy or demographics across projects. So if somebody's, let's say, low in recognition on their survey, but also in their 360 or something like that, you can figure out that this is a group, there's a population you want to nudge, figure out what kinds of things you want to do, like send them to the recognition platform, and figure out how to add a psychological or behavioral economic kind of dynamic, a behavioral science dynamic underlying it. And there's some scheduling services, and it also sets up research and evaluation where you can send some people one particular kind of nudge and some people another. I want to wrap up a little bit here by talking about one more example. There was a nudge study on promoting tetanus shots, right? And if I just gave people a lecture saying, hey, this is why getting a tetanus shot is important, 3 people got the tetanus shot. But if I gave you that lecture and you're a student, because that's where this research was done, I give the campus map, the health center is circled, and I say, look at your schedule and plan for when you're going to get the shot and where you're going to be at that time. And look at the map and actually, like with your finger, trace out the route between where you're going to be at that time and the health center. That boosted results to 28%. So what does this say? This says a couple of things. It says that training, which is kind of like the lecture, ain't enough, right? You can't just train people to do stuff and expect them to do it. Also, having people put something in their schedule matters, and you've seen that echoed throughout some of this this webinar. But where they're going to be and sort of planning the route, it might sound a little rudimentary, but it helped multiply the impact of this by 9 times, moving from 3% to more than 9 times that. That's pretty amazing. And so in our efforts, we want to be thinking about what is the campus map? What's the scheduling? What's the deciding the route kind of effort here? And so as we conclude, I'm going to ask you to grab a piece of paper, like right now, or open your notes app or something, and answer these questions. Are you the kind of person who values innovation in the programs you manage? Yeah. everybody already answered 100% on this in a poll earlier today. What are your favorite kinds of nudges? People answered that. They started giving thoughts. You all answered that. You did that for yourself. So what are some things that you're going to look at and try to learn a little bit more about? When are you going to do that? You've already started down this process with that other poll, but figure out, when are you going to do that? You get a bonus if you actually schedule that now, or maybe invite a buddy. That gives you a little bit more of a social commitment to do that. And then lastly, and I'm not going to pull this open and ask you all to answer it, but think about, like, what are the barriers to implementing nudges to improve your programs? And if you were to jot just a couple of notes, by the way, they did almost this exact same rhythm with voting. Like, and what are the barriers to getting to the polls when you want to go vote? Just thinking that through a little bit doubled the impact of the "are you a voter" kind of a nudge. And then I'm going to say, hey, feel free to email me if you want. Happy to respond and chat about this kind of stuff. But this, again, kind of maps that tetanus shot example, right? So with that, as you're mulling this over, I'm going to pause for any questions that people have. Jeff, do we have any questions coming through the chat, or
Sure.
any other sort of ways we want to?
We have, yeah, actually, we have
last couple minutes.
I think we have more questions than we're going to be able to get to. So let's hit a couple of them pretty quickly. One of the questions is a quick logistics question about nudge messaging. This one, I think, is about employee surveys. Are nudges only found within the survey, and what triggers them?
Yeah. Not just found within a survey. If we wanted to nudge people in the survey to write better comments, like that example I had before, that's in the survey, because that's when people are doing it. Reminding people to take a survey by saying, hey, most people taking the survey, once you've hit 51% response rate, take it. That's not technically in the survey. But most of what your problem is not driving data collection or response rates or anything like that. Most of your problem is probably getting people to act on the results. So the nudges need to exist after the results are available. Get people to, like I was talking about, those other specific behaviors, access their results, meet with their team, set a goal, monitor a plan, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of places where nudges can exist out in the wild. They won't just exist within a survey.
Here's another one. Some organizations provide nudges, but they seem generic. With your nudge ping tool, can nudges be customized to unique organizational language and offerings, and include things like links to LMS or internal resources?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that, it's great to have nudges that are tailored to your situation. And this year's challenges, or wherever the stage is, and trying to get managers to act on whatever you want them to act on. But yeah, I think that's essential.
And I think a follow-on, which I think becomes obvious, but let's hit it anyway. Can you have nudges targeted towards just certain job populations, such as managers, based on survey results, or frontline workers?
Yeah, I mean, that's important. When you think about the specific behavior that you're trying to nudge, who's doing that behavior, right? Yeah. That's where you want to nudge stuff. You want to nudge it at them. And so as you think through all the nature, it'll be important to do. But
one last one that I think we're really out of time, but one last quick one. Can you speak more to watch outs with bias? I'm not quite sure what that means.
Yeah.
Can you speak more to watch outs with bias? Okay.
I mean, I think what this is, or the way I might think about it is, you set up part of the original nudge discussion in the book was, the context for making decisions and working exists whether you try to manage it or not. Carrot sticks and desserts are in the cafeteria line, and are they just randomly placed, or are you a little bit more conscious about it? And so is it a bias to put desserts around the corner and people are less likely to go eat them, and carrot sticks up front at eye level? Is that a bias or not? I think it depends on what are the motives that you're aligning, of the organizations, of the managers, of the employees, and I think it's important to have all those be aligned. Um, there's deeper answers about this, but I know we're out
Okay.
of time.
Yep.
Like the 360 nudges and stuff like that. But
Yep. We are out of time. Thanks for all the questions. If we didn't get to your question, again, feel free to reach out to Scott or myself, and we'll get back to you. And with that, Scott, any concluding words?
no, what's on screen? Hopefully that you can honor the questions that are being asked of you here, and that will improve things. That's what the research says. So thanks. And as you conclude, there'll be a little pop-up survey, and if you could just take your time to respond to that, that would be terrific. But thanks, everybody.
Thanks for attending. We'll see you all. Bye-bye.